What were serial killers like in person before they got caught? A guy I work with used to carpool to school with Aaron Hernandez. A mutual friend used to go to high school with him and said he was a pretty normal kid for a while. He said he really changed when he went down to Florida for a summer for probably some football-related stuff. When he came back, he looked like a different person, all tatted up, bigger and taller. Spent a summer in Ames, Iowa with some family. Jeffrey Dahmer was a neighbor of a family friend. My cousin and I built a haunted house out of a playhouse in the backyard. Mostly we blindfolded the neighborhood kids and led them through. We had a bowl of grapes with some oil on them and shoved the kids' hands into it and told them it was eyeballs. We formed cold, congealed spaghetti into what we told them were brains. I personally led Jeffrey through, and every time someone says his name, I wonder if I was the cause of his problems. He was a loner in one of the biggest schools in the state. He wasn't weird or creepy or smelly or anything, but the popular kids would pick on him. He was friends with my girlfriend. We were going to hang out one weekend, but he bludgeoned his mother to death and ran away with his girlfriend instead. I'm probably relatively unique in that I know 3 people on death row, and 1 other murderer. Case number 1 was a completely horrible human being. Threatened my life in high school, and I always figured he'd kill someone in a bar fight. Instead, him and 2 friends went, and he had one of them kill the husband while he chased the wife down and shot her in the back. I was called to testify for the prosecution at his last death penalty trial. He was huge and scary as heck, and a truly, truly horrible human being. Based on the testimony I heard, he still is. The second was kind of an odd guy, but pretty nice in person. I played Starfleet battles with him. Him and a friend killed a lady. No idea why. He seemed more of a follower than a leader, and that's pretty much how the murder went down. He's still on death row. The third was more friends with my ex-wife. He even watched our kids a couple of times. He was quiet and seemed friendly. And finally, this other kid I knew in high school. He seemed pretty quiet, he read westerns a lot. Being a big book reader, I chatted a few times with him. He seemed nice. One day he took a shotty to school and at lunch blasted the guy convicted of taking advantage of his brother. He ended up getting a slap on the wrist for it. I felt he should have gotten a medal knowing the details that came out later. I suspect the judge gave him the least that he could. About 10 years before he took the lives of 2 women, he came to our house. He was about 16 or 17, on his bicycle with a chipmunk he had hung with a rope and was swinging it round and acting weird. My brother and I were home alone, and it was one time I know that my brother was scared in. We kept the doors locked, and he peed in our grill and left. The whole time he was yelling, but I'm not sure that it was at us. Yeah, that young man probably had a lot going on both in his home life and in his own head. So although you may have been on the receiving end of all that, he wasn't just angry at you. Cripes. A few years ago, I went to a gas station late at night and ran into an old friend. A guy I knew who had been serving time for some heinous crap. I heard he got out, and him and I were cool, so I didn't think much of it. He was with another guy, and right away the sight of the 2 of them sitting outside a gas station at a payphone made me uneasy. Teardrop tattoos on their faces and a desperate look about them. But my friend recognized me right away and came to say what's up. His friend immediately asked for a few dollars to get a cigar. I told him, hold up, and I'll get him on my way out. The whole time in that store, I felt uneasy. It looked like they were looking for a lick, and I didn't want that to be me. So I brought a cigar and gave him like $3. I chatted for about 5 minutes with my old friend and asked about his brother and stuff. As I hopped in my car, his friend asked if they could get a ride down the street. I got in and started the car and said, nah, can't. He started to insist, but my friend interrupted him and said, nah, my man has somewhere to be. He's got a bunch of kids that are probably crying. About 2 weeks later, 2 bodies were found smoldering along a popular jogging trail. The convicted murderer was the guy, along with my friend. The bodies were found within walking distance of the gas station I saw them at. My friend self-deleted about a month later. Both of those guys confessed to friends and family that they didn't know how to act outside of jail, and that they didn't feel like they were ready to be out. They tried to check themselves into psych hospitals, complaining of hearing voices, but they were turned away. The bodies were 2 high school kids who stole their neighbors' weapons and were trying to sell them quickly to get some green herb, I believe. These guys robbed the kids and tied them up for days. This all happened about 5 blocks from where I was living, in a relatively safe neighborhood in Florida. Oh, and the person with my friend was Jesse Davis, one of the convicted murderers in the Cady Way trial murders. I knew 2. They both grew up next door to one another. One had emotional problems and could be a decent guy one-on-one. We hung out a bit and rode bikes occasionally. He killed a guy in a substance deal and stuffed the body down a well. The other was a great guy, but he didn't give an F about anyone outside his circle of friends and his family. We'd hunted and fished together every day. He once told me he couldn't feel remorse if he killed someone outside his family. I thought it was just talk. This year, his sister's husband started whacking her, and this guy ambushed him in a country road and blasted him to death. Still, a decent guy in my book. I knew a serial committer of the unspeakable act. He was my kid's assistant little league coach and a great dad, one of the coolest people I knew. He loved his kids, was at all of their events, and worked hard as a doctor to support his family. His arrest shocked the crap out of the whole neighborhood. My cousin went to school with Timothy McVeigh. She says he was a really creepy loner who'd talk about conspiracy theories all the time. Jonathan David Drew, convicted of taking the life of Houston waitress Tina Flood, 23, in December of 1998. Drew was pulled over by a police officer who found Flood beaten and barely alive in Drew's front passenger seat. She died soon afterwards. Drew is suspected of several instances of the unspeakable act, and a private investigator has speculated Drew could be responsible for the slaying of Jessica Lee Kane. A search of Drew's former home in League City, where his parents still lived, produced a vial containing several human teeth. Yep, Jonathan David Drew was good friends with several people I hung out with. I knew him as an acquaintance. There were stories of him getting stuck out in the killing fields on at least 2 occasions late at night and having to be towed out. He was only convicted of the one murder, but there is speculation he's responsible for several more. Not me, but a buddy of mine was friends with the Boston bomber at University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. He says they used to hang out, drink, and do normal college stuff together. One of those you'd never expect it kind of situations. The thing that still gets me is that when he fled the scene, he briefly went back to Dartmouth to do whatever he had to do. But while there, he hit the gym with my buddy, and the story was all over every news outlet on TV. He turns to my buddy at the gym and proceeds to tell him, "How could anyone do something like this?" My sister's best friend growing up. Her family was really strict growing up, and she kind of took that on with her son. Wouldn't let him watch regular TV, he was homeschooled and that kind of thing. So she gets married because she got pregnant, again because she did this with her son's dad, and they move away. She joins the army, he cheats while she's at boot camp, they break up. Then she moves with other relatives in Oregon, and eventually he moves there too to be closer to his kid. Breaks it off with the other girl. They start to co-parent well and get along again. Everything's okay. They go on a camping trip in the mountains for his birthday with her sister. Then her and the sister proceed to shoot him 13 times while he slept and dragged and threw his body off a cliff. They come home to try and cover it up with all fake Facebook alibis and receipts from some gas station and say he got lost in the woods. The Rangers find him 2 days later, and 2 days after that she's arrested along with her sister. Her sister flipped on her immediately and they gave her 18 months with time served. The main perp got life without parole. She said she did it to make sure he couldn't take her kids away. Now the kids live with family and have lost both parents. I always knew that family was off. In short, my sister's best friend planned and killed her ex-husband to protect the kids, and then threw him off a cliff, was found and convicted, and kids have no parents now. Someone told me they made an episode of Snapped Off for her story. So yeah, I guess I can say the name of the episode. It's Patricia McCallum. Cripes. Protecting kids here may have been code for ensuring we don't have to share custody anymore. As much as being a child of divorce sucks, I can't imagine that the fallout of that was any better, and I can't imagine that the co-parenting was so bad that it was even worth the risk of getting caught. You can submit your own stories to be featured here on the channel. The story submission link is in the description below. And if you want to listen to some vibey music in the background, check out Easy Mode, also linked below, and subscribe. I dated and was friends with a guy who was arrested in a huge CP bust in my area. We'll call him John. He was a very sweet and kind guy, the kind who'd do just about anything for a friend. We met at a class and we hit it off right away, which led to a sort of relationship. We split on good terms, he had different ideas about relationships, so we broke up before anyone got too involved. We remained very good friends who'd just hang out every weekend, spend some time at each other's houses, playing video games, or just get into general messing around. About 3 months later, he started dating a girl from his job and took her on vacation to New York City. They'd only been dating for a few weeks, but in true fashion, he was head over heels for her. He sent me a picture of them, and the girl looked so young I asked if he saw her ID before they'd done the deed. He proudly told me she had just turned 19. He was 43. They split up after she'd spent the weekend at his place, and her father came looking for her. Her father went ballistic, and that was the end of it. I started putting the pieces together, and I realized I was looking at one gigantic red flag. I was 27 when we were dating, but he always loved to play up how young I looked. He was also very into age play during the deed, which was one of the reasons we split. He started dating other girls between the ages of 18 and 21, but they all had the same hallmark of definitely not looking like the age of consent, to the point that they were usually stopped from entering clubs or bars because the bouncers assumed the girls had fake IDs or borrowed an older relative's ID. He started drinking more, picking up working girls, going into massage parlors, and being all around that creepy old guy. He chalked it up to going through a rough patch, but there was something still very off about him. He went to New York City with another girl and asked me and another mutual friend to watch his house for the week. I got a frantic phone call from my friend saying that John's house had been broken into and all of his electronics were stolen. At the time, I was mid-move and John had allowed me to store several boxes of electronics at his place after the storage facility I had them in had been broken into. I went over and sure enough, all of John's TVs, computers, game systems, and other things were gone. But my things were left alone. I found that odd because I had a flat-screen TV and a flat-screen computer in their boxes sitting in his dining room. If he had been robbed, why didn't they take my things? When the cops showed up, all they'd tell us is that it wasn't a burglary, but wouldn't give us any more information. That's when I found the search warrant on his kitchen table. John came back from New York City and he asked me to drive him to the state trooper station. All he'd say was that he got a phone call asking him to show up there. Once there, he was immediately arrested. Like, they met us in the parking lot and yanked him out of my car before I had a chance to put it into park. One of the detectives asked me to come into the station and they interviewed me, asking how I knew him and so on and so forth. After about an hour, they let me go outside to have a cigarette. That's when they told me he was being arrested for 22 counts of downloading and distributing loads of CP. They also told me it had been going on for a very long time, long enough that surveillance on his house had pictures of me coming and going. So yeah, that's my story. Sorry it's so long. I dated someone who murdered a guy with his friends. It was personal and it made national news. A few months after he and I broke up, I was dating someone else. He called me and said that he was never going to be with me because he messed everything up. I was busy and I blew him off. A week later, after a holiday, I got a call from the jail, but it was at like 4 in the morning and I accidentally hung up. A few years later, I looked him up and realized the call was him. I'm afraid that he holds a grudge, and as his release creeps closer, I'm getting worried. So what was he like before? He was melodramatic. After we broke up, he called me and played Cry Me a River and told me that we were just like the song. He beat himself up quite a lot. Everything was a huge deal. We argued a lot and he was easily influenced. He didn't have a good relationship with his parents, so his friends were all he had. He had a history of disciplinary actions in school. Respect was a huge thing. Feeling disrespected to him was the worst thing in the world. He didn't care about school. He was funny. This guy isn't famous, not yet anyway. All this happened just about a month ago. Maybe a little longer. The guy's name is Adam Densmore. He killed his girlfriend and cut her into pieces. He put the body in a couple of suitcases and took their 1-year-old daughter on the road. I always thought he was an intelligent guy, but apparently he wasn't the smartest, as he immediately drove from where he was living in Colorado to his hometown in northwest Louisiana, straight to his parents' house. He dropped the suitcases in 2 separate locations along the way. Someone found one of them and he was arrested. As far as I know, they still haven't found the other suitcase. I knew him, but not very well. We used to frequent the same bar. He'd sit in the corner with a beer and read. He was rude to anyone who tried to speak to him. He had that whole, "Can't you see I'm reading?" attitude. In most cases, I understand that attitude, but not in a bar. Never made sense to me. We talked a few times, but only talked at length once. I remember it being an enjoyable conversation. He was intelligent and well-spoken. Also, a good-looking guy, but not exactly charming. One thing I remember is that he'd say, "Gods," in place of, "Oh my God." I know he lived somewhere near me because I'd see him walking around the neighborhood on occasion with a big walking stick. So yeah, he was a bit of a strange guy, but I was shocked when I heard about what happened. It still feels weird to realize I know someone who would do something like that. Okay, mine wasn't famous, but it was still messed up. Brett Pearson was high on crystal and killed his mother and also injured his father. He cried crocodile tears and acts like he regrets it, but I knew him and I know for a fact that he doesn't regret a thing. I went to school with him for a few years. Myself and others were both repeatedly intimidated by him in both stalking and violent manners. There was just something off about him. The only friends he had were the problem kids and the major buttholes at school. He'd make super inappropriate comments in class towards teachers and joked about school mass tragedies, and would say things just for shock value. But he was a charmer and got away with everything. I know for a fact he doesn't regret killing his mom. The murder happened only a few blocks from my house. I think the part of this that I'm having the hardest time relating to the rest was that he was apparently charming enough to get away with this stuff. But then again, Ted Bundy was a whole thing, wasn't he? So maybe this guy is the crystal-addicted version of him. Sounds like a creep. I'm glad he's put away now. Oh, and speaking of the big, charming, handsome psychopath himself, here he is in the next story. Obligatory not me, but my mum saw Ted Bundy running through the woods after he escaped prison. They realized who it was after the cops came searching door to door. Not directly, but I know several people who knew Willie Picton before he was arrested. I worked with a lady that had her husband murdered. She was a bossy, condescending, arrogant piece of white trash. Rather nicely attractive though, and very openly flirtatious. She was about 15 years older, but I'd be lying if I said I hadn't thought about it. Wasn't surprised when they finally nailed her for the crime. Everyone suspected she did it. I sat next to Jeffrey Dahmer at a bar in Milwaukee. I guess I just wasn't to his taste. My boyfriend and his friend kidnapped 2 people, drove them out to a field, and blasted them execution style. He was a really good guy except for that whole killing thing, but we were young and impulsive. I often think about reaching out to him, but time changes people, prison changes people, and I'm not quite sure what I'd say. I was taught in a pottery class by Margaret Bain and good friends with Stephen Bain when growing up in Papua New Guinea. I don't remember anything unusual about any of the family, but I remember vividly reading in the newspaper in Papua New Guinea about their deaths in New Zealand. Still not 100% clear whether it was just Stephen's dad or his brother as well that committed the murders. I didn't know the killer, but as adults, I met a guy and we became friends. It took him a few weeks to tell me he had changed his surname as everyone knew his brother, and he felt he'd be judged the same. At the time of the murder, it was classed as one of the most foul in Australian history. He told me even though his brother was locked up, he was scared of him, and he talked about the constant mental, physical, and other unspeakable treatment the children in the family had suffered growing up by his father and cohorts. His brother liked to do a lot of illegal stuff with animals, which was a forewarning of what he had become. I lost contact with my friend when he moved interstate, and I've tried to find him, because I miss him. I worked with the man who made national news for killing a doctor who worked in a clinic. When I knew him, he was quiet, polite, a nice guy as far as working with him, but he got in with the pro-life people, and if I recall correctly, he was having marital trouble at the time. One of his co-workers had asked him to work a shift for him that day, but he declined, saying he had something to do. Well, we all sure found out what he did. It was pretty shocking, really. Extended family member murdered 2 people and was suspected of murdering another. He and his mother and siblings lived with us for a few months when we were very young children, so young that I only have vague memories of this. It was while his mother was trying to leave her very nasty husband. The husband was a real animal and probably had something to do with the guy turning out the way he did. And what was our main character like? Well, as a young kid, he was just your typical child. Maybe enjoyed getting other people in trouble a bit more than most, but that's about it. As a teen and young adult, he was a very scary character. You'd get a real menacing vibe from him, like he was completely unpredictable. Which was strange because he always acted very calm. You just had this sense that there was way more going on under the surface. As a family member, I always felt safe around him. Strange to say that, I know, but I still always felt like he couldn't be trusted around others. Plus, even though instinctively I felt safe, rationally I knew most likely I wasn't. So I made sure I was never alone with him. You could tell there was something not quite right about him. We were all a little relieved when he died suddenly, still quite young. Eventually, he would have paroled out and someone else would have probably died. Gary M. Heidnick used to frequent a bar popular with veterans that my grandfather met his friends at a few times a month. He was usually quiet, and on Christmas Eve, my grandfather's friend brought the guy a beer and talked to him for a few minutes, thinking he might be a guy with PTSD. Came back and said, "There's a screw loose with that guy." Few weeks later, he got into a fight with someone and my grandfather helped the bartender throw him out. He never came back. When you subscribe, make sure to hit the bell to turn on notifications. Put the playlist on in the background to finish listening to all the stories, or if you want some vibey music to put on in the background, check out Easy Mode. If you like Am I the Genius, give Am I the Jerk a shot. Everything linked in the description.